Roll the window down 3 times. Turn on the air conditioning. Is that evidence of intent to apply lawful force? Officer Chauvin confirms that Mr. Floyd is under arrest. He's under arrest right now for forgery. What's going on? For what? Officer Chauvin made a decision not to use higher levels of force when he would have been authorized to do that, including punches, kicks, elbows, right? All of these tools were available to Officer Chauvin. Is also refocusing the other officers, telling them they need to do things to pay attention to Mr. Floyd. Should I put his stuff in the car? No, we need to get him in the ambulance. Let's refocus, right? Officer Chauvin had no intent to purposefully use, or he did not purposefully use unlawful force. These are officers doing their job in a highly stressful situation. According to their training, according to the policies of the Minneapolis Police Department, and it's tragic. It's tragic. They go to the hospital. They perform CPR. They call their supervisors. Was this an eminently dangerous act? Was putting Mr. Floyd an eminently dangerous act? We've heard a lot about the prone position. Consider just the basic prone position. People sleep in the prone position. People suntan in the prone position. People get massages in the prone position. The prone position in and of itself is not an inherently dangerous act. It is not an inherently dangerous act. A prone position during restraint is not an inherently dangerous act. It is routinely trained and used by the Minneapolis Police Department. The studies show, right? Canadian studies that were referenced by Dr. Fowler. 1,269 cases, use of force, 1 death of a person not in the prone position. Right? These are people, they're looking at people in the prone position. 4,828 consecutive force events. No significant clinical effects on the subject's physiology. Right? We can look at all of the other studies trying to determine this question is putting a subject in the prone position, even with officers on top, even with weight on top of the person, is that inherently dangerous? And the research says no. The practical experience says yeah, that says no. The prone position, when applied through a use of force, is not an eminently dangerous act because there is no evidence to support the notion that it is highly likely, that's the standard, highly likely to cause death. There's reasonable doubt about that. So let's talk about the cause of death. And again, I'm sorry to be long-winded, but I have to address the cause of death. Because the state neglected to read perhaps one of the most important sentences from the instruction, and why you must read the instruction carefully. Yes, the defendant is criminally liable for all of the consequences of his actions that occur in the ordinary and natural course of events, including those consequences brought about by one or more intervening causes. If such intervening causes were the natural result of the defendant's act. Okay? So if the intervening causes were the natural consequences of the defendant's acts, he's liable. So think about it in this example. Police officer arrests someone. He puts that person on a hot August afternoon in the back seat of a squad car, rolls up the window, turns on the heat, and leaves the person in there. Right? Person dies of a heat stroke. Officer put him in there and is responsible for the natural consequences of his actions. But consider the situation where a police officer arrests someone, they're compliant, they go into the backseat of the squad car, they're sitting in the backseat of the squad car, and they have a heart attack, they have a pulmonary embolism, they have a brain aneurysm. Something happens to that person that was not the natural consequence of being arrested. It was just a physiological something that happened to that individual. The officer's not liable because it's not in the natural course of events. And it's not the result, the natural result of the defendant's act. Right? So again, read the entire instruction. The significance of this instruction, again, is that it goes through all of the three charges. You have to be convinced that the defendant's actions caused the death of Mr. Floyd. And throughout the course of this trial, the state has tried and called numerous witnesses to try to convince you that asphyxiation is the singular cause of death. The singular cause of death. And why is that? It's because actions that happened before Mr. Floyd was arrested that have nothing to do with Officer Chauvin's activities are not the natural consequences of the defendant's actions. You have to play no role in this stuff. They're trying to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Floyd's heart disease played no role in this case. The state was trying to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Floyd's history of hypertension played absolutely no role in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death. The state must convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Floyd was not experiencing excited delirium that contributed to the cause of his death. The state has to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Floyd's paraganglioma was not contributing to the cause of death. The state must convince you beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Floyd's toxicology played no role in his death. Right? The state would have to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that a combination of these pre-existing issues did not contribute to Mr. Floyd's death. That is why the state has brought in expert after expert after expert to testify that the singular cause of death here is asphyxiation. Because if Mr. Floyd was asphyxiated as a result of the police restraint, he is liable for the natural consequences of that restraint, of his actions. But if any of these other factors come into it, if any of these other factors were substantial contributing factors of Mr. Floyd's death, because they were not the natural result of the restraint. The person has drugs in their system, and that drug causes an overdose. In the context of the police restraint, it's not the natural consequence of the restraint, it's the natural consequence of the deceased's actions.